Hi folks, morning. Excuse me, got a bit of a sore throat today. Um, Today I want to talk about the number 9 book on my James Herbert list. Um, and before I do so, I want to talk a little bit about something that I've mentioned over the course of this video series, which is why I've got the camera facing away from me, just the covers of books. So I'm just going to have basic examples, but I haven't got the book to hand here. I've got a couple of books to hand, but this one in particular I haven't. Just want to show you this image, because this is the image of James Herbert's 48. That's how most of James Herbert's books look now. The dimensions are, like I say, the same as classic literature, so they're quite large books. But that is how almost all James Herbert books now look, the republished style, and it's something that I really don't like. It doesn't tell you anything about the book. It doesn't look like a horror novel. They're all these weird black and white montages with a splash of colour in the title, and I don't think they look particularly good. That doesn't look appealing to me. So that's that's just something here. Whereas if you look at, I mean, the most recent publication style we had, for example, was this, which I think looks better. Obviously, the books are still quite large, but that was a better style. It looks a bit more like a horror novel, but it still doesn't really appeal to me massively as a horror book. It still doesn't scream horror to me. The dimensions are quite large, and although it's better than the black and white imagery, it's still very vague. Now, they did do a little better with the recent re-release of The Fog, which I bought because I quite like. It's the 5th anniversary version. I quite like the style of that. That to me looks more like a horror book, but it's still there's still something about it. Again, in terms of size, that I'm not a fan of. And what I mean is the older ones. If I look at some of my earlier Herbert books, like the Jonah, you can see dimensionally that is much smaller. I mean, this is a very, very old copy. That's a much smaller book. The dimensions are way better. It looks horror. I mean, the cover, that is just horrific, isn't it? That's just how I prefer Herbert books to look. And yeah, it's just something, especially when you compare the size of the books there. There's a huge difference in I just don't like the size of them. I just don't think it's great. So anyway, I'm going to have something fairly interesting because I don't have the book to hand at the moment. I'm going through my collection. I just bought a couple of books there. I'm not going back upstairs. So you can have some brand that I'm not associated with, mild salsa to look at today because I'm not going to switch the camera because it will turn off again. So at number 9, finally getting to it, on my James Herbert ranking, I've put his 2001 novel, Once, which is a sort of, I think in many ways a pseudo sequel to The Magic Cottage, and also a threequel in the Rumpo series, because Rumpo, the squirrel, I mentioned his first appearance was in Fluke, and then he appeared a lot in The Magic Cottage, and he also appears in this. And this parallels The Magic Cottage, and then it's about magic and folklore and fairy folk, and about a guy who basically discovers that fairies are real, along with goblins and other things. It's a folk tale, and it's another very well written, very well crafted, if slightly long, book by Herbert, and I really enjoy the basic story of this. I think it is a really interesting adult fairy tale. The reason why I say adult isn't just because it's quite violent, but there's no getting away from it. This is James Herbert's sex book. This has more graphic descriptions of sex than in anything else Herbert wrote. And after a little while, it does get a bit grating because Herbert wasn't great at writing sex scenes. That in general, I don't enjoy reading sex scenes in books anyway. I don't think there's a need for them. I think if you're going to be tasteful, and have a tiny bit of intimacy between people. You can go that route, but I'm not a big fan of sex scenes between characters, which is why, despite the fact that I enjoy a great deal of Richard Lehman books, the sex stuff really puts me off. And it's the same with Graham Aston has a lot of it in his books, and he writes from the perspective of a porn director rather than a loving couple, And Herbert here, he tries to do more explicit sex that isn't always consensual, and it kind of mars the story a little because there's just a bit too much of it, especially considering it's not humans on humans. It's a bit weird in some places, but irrespective of that, this story is a dark fairy tale story, and I think most people enjoyed, certainly when they were kids, fairy tale stories, and this is one for adults. And there's something about it that just sort of takes you away from the realities of the world and life, and is quite absorbing and interesting. And it's certainly very picturesque, and it certainly does a lot with words. This is, I think, by Herbert's standards, a very eloquently written book. And has a great sense of picturesque poetry almost. So it's got some dark action. To be honest, there's not a lot I can really say about this without spoiling it again. I mean, this isn't a full review. I can understand some people think that this ranking series, I'm not really going into great detail about some of these books, but I'm not reviewing them, I'm ranking them. So there is a difference. I don't need to go into depth and talk a blow-by-blow account of what happens in the book, just to give you an overview and where it rates. So I'd put Once at number 9 on my list because I think it's unlike anything else he's done in flavour, in visual style, in language. Certainly it's designed to be, I feel, an erotic fantasy. And it does work on that level. Your mileage will vary depending on how you enjoy that sort of stuff. But I still think it's a very good book. I think it's by far the best of all of his post-2000 novels. Herbert was in a real slump in the 2000s, putting out a lot of dross, and with elevated periods of time between his books. And I think this is by far the best one he did in that period. Although it's still a huge come down from the books he did before it, which we'll get to. But I still enjoy it a lot. I think its use of fairy folk and goblins and that sort of thing is quite interesting. It's not something he's ever done. He'd hinted at it in The Magic Cottage, but here it's almost like what would happen after that. Even though it's an unrelated story, like I say, it's got Rumpo in it, and it does feature magic and fairies and things, and it is... I enjoy it. I think it's good. I'd probably put it higher up if it wasn't so filled with sex stuff. I do skim through a lot of it, and it is a long book, but it's still a very good novel. And I do classify it as horror, even though this is a sort of gothic erotic fairy tale story. It does have horror elements in it. It is quite graphic, but it's so unique that I've put it at number 9. I had to include it in my top 10, and I like it just a little more than the Jonah, so that's where it is. So it's not a brand that I don't necessarily support, Mild Salsa. It is Once by James Herbert at number 9.